Is Ghostbusters 2 as good as the original? This is a debate that for some reason has been trending on the internet, and as most diehard fans will tell you, it's a resounding no. I've heard everything from it's just okay to it flat out sucks, and that it basically ruined the franchise even before the 2016 reboot came along. So what about the people who still like Ghostbusters 2? I mean, this is the internet. Aren't our opinions valid too? I genuinely really enjoyed this movie, but before my rebuttal, let's get a few things out of the way. First, it's hard for me to look at either of these movies without the use of rose-colored nostalgia glasses. These films were a big part of everyone's childhood. Everyone in my generation, anyway. I feel like any time someone discusses these movies, there's a big part of them that is reaching out from the little kid inside. Most of you had the toys and watched the cartoon. So naturally, when the sequel came around, of course you all went ape shit. Here's the thing. I was born in January of 1983. I was a little over a year old when that first movie came out. I didn't get the chance to experience the original movie until sometime after Ghostbusters 2 came out. But in 1989, I was 6 years old, and Ghostbusters 2 was new. I didn't have that first movie to compare it to, and to be honest, I might have watched an episode or two of the cartoon, but I was really more of a Ninja Turtles kid. But I was aware of the show, so when I got to see a live-action version of it, I was curious. And honestly, as most of you might have guessed, I was hooked. Everything that a lot of people felt worked in that first movie worked for me then. Bill Murray's spot-on humor, the special effects, the over-the-top tone. It was a good movie. Something a lot of you know, but it bears repeating for the purpose of this argument, Ghostbusters 2 was the sequel that no one but the studio wanted to make. The original film stood on its own, and while it was popular enough with the kids to spawn an animated series and a successful line of toys, it really didn't beg for a sequel. But by the time the sequel came around, Ghostbusters was a franchise. It might help to think of Ghostbusters 2 not as a sequel to the original film, but as a loose adaptation of the cartoon, even though it does follow the continuity of that first movie. It's also a common criticism that Ghostbusters 2 is basically a beat-for-beat recreation of the first film. There are no new ideas, and this is a criticism that I agree with. Everything from the opening scene, the montage of the Ghostbusters building on their success, and overpowering evil that emanates from a building connected to Dana Barrett.
I hate Jell-O.
Oh, come on, there's always room for Jell-O.
Right up to the climax involving a giant supernatural deity destroying the city.
Sorry! Right,
Yeah, it's one of those sequels. Simply put, back then, sequels either risked trying something new, your Temple of Dooms, Gremlins 2s, and Bogus Journeys, which were entertaining but often performed with mixed results from fans and critics, or you had basic rehashes. And while Ghostbusters 2 is more blatant with its approach, let's not pretend that it's the only sequel to cheapen out and copy a formula. Horror movies and action flicks are the biggest offenders here. Look at Die Hard 2. Not a bad movie on its own, but it's literally the first movie just set in an airport. The Lethal Weapon series. Each installment got crazier and more cartoon-like, but they were all more or less trying to recreate what was set up in the first film. Sometimes the sequels managed to rise to the occasion. I actually think Lethal Weapon 2 is superior to the original. I think most of us would agree that most sequels just aren't as good. The only exception I can think of is when you have a situation like Star Trek the Motion Picture, which many would argue wasn't hard to surpass because it wasn't a great movie to begin with. Getting that out of the way, let's finally look at this film so I can explain why I actually enjoy it. Right off the bat, I'm not saying Ghostbusters 2 is better than the original, and I'll openly admit there are a few scenes I could do without. Pretty much anything dealing with Dana's baby Oscar, and any scene with both Janosch and Dana. But I seriously enjoy this movie at least on the same level. So here we go. It seems that one of the biggest criticisms with this film is that it's not as adult as the first film. This would make sense. Ghostbusters 2 was made as a result of the success of the cartoon, and was taking into account that there were a lot of kids who were now interested in the franchise. That meant they couldn't have the characters all smoking like chimneys, and absolutely no ghost blowjobs. Many would argue that the first film was made for adults.
You will perish in flames! What an asshole.
Kids gravitated toward the special effects, but a lot of the jokes probably went over their heads. I seriously don't know what I would have made of Dan Aykroyd getting a ghost blowjob as a kid, but what I'm trying to say is, of all the memorable moments in Ghostbusters, do scenes like this really make or break the movie? It certainly makes an otherwise innocent movie about hunting ghosts seem more adult, but it was a simple joke. And let's remember, both movies were rated PG. It wasn't like Ghostbusters was this hard R movie where everyone cusses like sailors and it had a lot of violence and tits. I don't know why this is such a big deal when movies today are much more guilty of toning down the R-rated parts to appeal to bigger audiences. Not a great example, but look at the recent Coming to America, a film that feels like a glorified Disney Channel movie, and it's a sequel to an actual R-rated film. What about all the times an R-rated franchise gets a toned-down installment, like what happened with Live Free or Die Hard? Those movies suffered much more because honestly, how can you have a PG-13 John McClane? It's not Die Hard without a little yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker. So while no, the Ghostbusters aren't smoking or soliciting sex from horny ghosts, I know it seems like Ray is getting this service against his will, but I fully believe he was soliciting this ghost here. I don't think it's fair to take points away just because, oh my god, the Ghostbusters are suddenly more health conscious. At least they still get to use their proton packs. Hell, even in Turtles 2, the turtles weren't even allowed to use their weapons. For fuck's sakes. Another criticism is that the characters were all changed around, and I guess they resemble their cartoon counterparts. Again, I respectfully disagree. I really didn't watch the cartoon, so I can't really use that as a basis for comparison, but I remember loving Bill Murray when I first saw this movie. Keep in mind, I hadn't seen the original yet. But, and this is where you can feel free to disagree with me, regarding the 4 central characters, I think it's pretty spot on. Part of the humor in that original flick was the delivery.
I think this building should be condemned. There's serious metal fatigue in all the load-bearing members. The wiring is substandard. It's completely inadequate for our power needs. And the neighborhood is like a demilitarized zone.
Egon was the scientist and was always taking a scientific approach to everything, no matter how crazy stuff was around him. It was his static, unemotional delivery and nonchalant reaction to things that made his character work. Fans say that everyone looks bored in that second film, and I'm sorry, I don't see it. Bill Murray is another one. He's the smartass. He's also the heart of the Ghostbusters. I don't know if he's got any dialogue equivalent to his iconic "this man has no dick" line.
Is this true? Yes, it's true. This man has no dick.
But would you really expect it to? When you especially look at how abysmal most comedy sequels end up being, I'm surprised at how much a lot of this dialogue holds up.
Would you please tell the court why it is that you and your co-defendants took it upon yourselves to dig a very big hole in the middle of First Avenue?
Well, there's so many holes in First Avenue, we really didn't think anyone would notice.
Then there's the issue with Janine Melnitz and her crazy orange hair. Undoubtedly, they were trying to capitalize on the character from the cartoon. Now I get it. You can't have Ghostbusters without Annie Potts. She was one of the staples from the original film, with her thick New York accent and her crude declaration of,
"Ghostbusters, what do you want?"
From my understanding, the character was changed a lot throughout the course of the show, but let's talk about how she carries over from the first film. Aside from her appearance, I think Annie Potts did a fair job after not playing the role for 5 years.
Ghostbusters. Yes, we're back.
She's playing the same character, she uses the same accent. She's Janine, no argument. I will say that the writers cut down on some of her quips and focused mainly on her charm. This could work both ways, and if it wasn't for her romantic interaction with Louis Tully, I would probably look at this as a minor negative. After all, her undeniable sass is what makes her character stand out. But like any of the returning characters, I can't imagine a movie without her. She doesn't have any bad scenes, and there's nothing she does where I can honestly say, well, the old Janine wouldn't have done that. I find her still really funny, and again, she works well with Rick Moranis. There are a couple of things missing from this movie. It doesn't have a Walter Peck, and Rick Moranis, although funny during the court scene, isn't given much to do. I'd rather have him in the movie than not at all, but there it is. Kurt Fuller isn't bad as this film's watered-down version of Peck, but he was dialed down quite a bit. I think one of Venkman's funnier lines, again, is directed toward this character.
There seem to be 3 million completely miserable assholes living in the tri-state area.
Oh, please.
I beg your pardon, 3,000,001.
Hey.
But he's nowhere near as menacing as William Atherton. However, I do think the movie balances this out by giving us a more menacing main villain. We already have Janosch and Vigo, so maybe we didn't need the return of Walter Peck. Sorry that "this man has no dick" line was in the back of my mind.
Everything was fine with our system until the power grid was shut off by Dickless here.
And going back to the complaints of Janine and maybe some other characters being a little more reserved, let's say Janine was written exactly as she was in the original movie. Did you really want her going,
"Ghostbusters, what do you want?"
again? You're already complaining that this movie is too much like the original, so why can't some of the characters evolve? Frankly, having her talk about parenthood with Louis Tully is a pretty sweet change of pace. And let's talk about comedy for a minute. Comedy might be the most subjective thing ever. What makes me laugh isn't going to always make you laugh. And trust me, I've laughed at some pretty dumb things. All I can say here is that I'm not going to compare every scene to the original film. When I watch Ghostbusters 2, I'm judging it based on Ghostbusters 2, and I still laugh. It's not all comedy gold. I'll be honest, some of the jokes in that first movie fell flat to me too. I can't explain or defend this, but I think it's a pretty funny film. The scene in the courtroom where Venkman is helping Louis Tully with their case, Bill Murray's speech to Viggo during the last scene, or pretty much anything with Bill Murray here.
Only a Carpathian would come back to life now and choose New York. Tasty pick, bonehead.
Some of the stuff with the dancing toaster still holds up.
What kind of test?
Well, we sing to it, and we talk to it, and say supportive, nurturing things to it.
You're not sleeping with it, are you, Ray?
Some of it is cheesy, but I get a rise out of it. What about Peter McNichol as Janosch? The common consensus is that people seem to like him most of all, and for good reason. Look at him.
No photographs, please. Slides are available in the gift shop. Eh?
He's not only eccentric and funny, but sometimes, like in this scene where he's walking down the hall with the headlight eyes, he's legitimately terrifying. And let's not forget one of my favorite moments, when the Titanic arrives. No one mentions Cheech Marin's response.
Well, better late than never.
This was the film that taught me about the Titanic, by the way. I think if James Cameron ended his movie Titanic with this scene, he would have had an instant classic on his hands. Stupid James Cameron and his stupid fucking boat movie. Once again, we have a pretty memorable villain in the form of Viggo the Carpathian.
Also known as Viggo the Cruel, Viggo the Torturer, Viggo the Despised, and Viggo the Unholy.
Wasn't he also Viggo the Butch?
I want you to look at all those Marvel and DC movies you all flock to and praise endlessly. One of the biggest problems with those movies? Weak villains. Once in a while, you might get a Thanos, but that was how many movies in? Now, which is a better villain, Gozer or Viggo? Again, this is really a coin toss. When the Ghostbusters confront both villains, they've prepared a batch of witty banter both times, and it's equally as funny in both films.
Go get her, Ray.
I know, the climactic battle on the rooftop of Dana's building is iconic, and that image of the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man is unforgettable. Those are two things I won't dare dispute, but if we're not talking about pure iconic imagery, I think they both work. Viggo is pretty threatening, well, up until the end when he gets a hold of baby Oscar. It gets pretty anticlimactic after that. But overall, Viggo is more of a presence. We see him all throughout the film, and the fact that he's mainly a painting makes him even creepier. With Gozer, we got his representation through his two minions, Vince Clortho and Zool. When Gozer was finally revealed in the film's final moments, she doesn't look that threatening. In fact, she looks like she belongs in an 80s Jazzercise infomercial. The scene where she asks Ray if he's a god is pretty funny, but it's just a line of dialogue. It doesn't make or break the scene. Another scene I love in Ghostbusters 2 is the courtroom scene. I mentioned this already, but one of my favorite things about sequels is when we're reintroduced to characters.
Do. Ray.
Be gone.
Up until this point, the Ghostbusters are in pretty dire straits, having been sued by every city, county, and state agency in New York, being reduced to glorified entertainers at kids' birthday parties, and not being allowed to work as paranormal investigators. Having the Ghostbusters finally get to don their proton packs for a legitimate reason is a lot of fun, and one of the reasons why I appreciate how the movie begins. Does the setup make sense? This seems to be the problem with a lot of sequels. We need the characters to end up at point Z, but how we get them there doesn't really matter. After the Ghostbusters save New York in the first film, does it make sense that they would get sued out of business? Logically, no. But if we're going to have this fun montage where the Ghostbusters make their triumphant return, then we need to start them off at rock bottom. This would traditionally be called drama. However, audiences today are not willing to suspend disbelief as much as they were 30 years ago, and largely because of the internet, eagle-eyed fans are looking for any reason to disparage a film. And let's not forget, these films are technically comedies, so I think we're allowed to jump the shark once in a while as long as it gets a few laughs. I always bought the fact that the Ghostbusters were simply seen as a public nuisance because of all the damage they caused.
Look, you stay away from the mayor. He's running for governor next fall, and the last thing we need is for him to be associated with two-bit frauds and publicity hounds like you and your friends.
Going back to all of today's superhero films, those movies you all seem to praise, like your fucking Zack Snyder raising Superman to the peerage, this seems to be a pretty common storytelling tool, where our heroes are actually put on trial for all the destruction they've caused rather than simply being praised as heroes. If you're willing to accept that in Captain America Civil War and that dumbass Batman v Superman movie, then why does Ghostbusters 2, a fucking comedy, get beaten to death with socks filled with bars of soap? Another critique I've heard is that Ghostbusters 2 was shot more like a comedy, whereas the original was shot more like a horror film. I have a degree in film, so I'm not completely ignorant on this topic. Then again, I'm not a cinematographer, so I don't really have a keen eye when it comes to this. If you want to split hairs, the first film is grittier than its sequel. What can I say? The first movie didn't have to follow on the heels of a fucking cartoon. I never thought of the original Ghostbusters as a horror movie. It has horror elements, sure, but first and foremost, it is a comedy. It isn't Poltergeist or The Evil Dead, where it has incidental humor sprinkled in as a result of amateur filmmaking. It's a legitimate, funny film. Whether Ivan Reitman intended it that way or not, the final result is a comedy. So why shouldn't Ghostbusters 2 be shot like a comedy? It still maintains those horror elements, and the effects, I think, still hold up. It's probably more of an effects extravaganza than the original, something else it gets criticized for. Even Bill Murray said there was a much deeper focus on effects the second time around. This boils down to a clash of styles, and I don't really think the styles are all that much different. You're comparing apples to slightly redder apples. If you watch both movies back to back, they feel a part of the same universe. Bill Murray actually said a lot about the making of this film, and at one point, I might be misquoting him here, I believe he said that making Ghostbusters 2 was a miserable experience. But just because one of the movie's key stars has that opinion doesn't mean that everyone needs to have that opinion. Making a movie is a tough, arduous process. Everyone involved is on set for weeks, sometimes months at a time. They work on these things for 12 or even 14 hours at a time, all so we can view the finished 2-hour product. Of course they're going to have strong opinions about their experiences. They're connected so strongly to it. This isn't a movie to them, it's their career. So when someone as revered as Steven Spielberg says Temple of Doom is his least favorite of the Indiana Jones films, he's speaking from the experience of actually making it. That doesn't mean you're automatically inclined to agree with him. Just like what you like. Then there are the nitpicky gripes that I'll never understand. One of the complaints, I guess, is that the slime is pink in the movie. Really? You're right. Ghostbusters 2 absolutely sucks because of the pink slime. I mean, how do I even approach this? My understanding was that the actual slime you could buy in stores was pink, and this was the studio just trying to sell toys. But let's pretend you're 6 years old and you weren't aware of how marketing worked. And because of an incident involving hair, my mom didn't allow me to play with slime. The pink slime in the beginning might seem weird, I guess, but later on, when we see the river of slime, the pink glow it has really makes it stand out. It kind of reminds me of blood. And I get it, it's not blood, but it's a pretty striking image. This scene just wouldn't have worked if the slime was green. And this wasn't the first time slime was this color. Look at the Ninja Turtles cartoon.
It wasn't slime. It was ooze.
Well, I'm at a loss with this one. If you want to hate on this movie so much that you're picking on the pink slime, then you're just destined to hate this movie for all eternity, and I feel bad for you. The fact of the matter is, when a studio does something drastically different with a sequel, you complain that it bears little resemblance to the original, and you leave disappointed. Think about Gremlins 2 or Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. Then, if a sequel follows the exact same formula, it didn't deviate all that much, and you just paid for the exact same movie, and again, you're left disappointed. I've heard a lot of different fan pitches for a proposed true Ghostbusters sequel, and I'll be honest, most of these pitches really don't interest me, and just because your idea is a radically different take on Ghostbusters doesn't mean it'll make a good or even better movie. When it comes to big franchise movies, everyone is subconsciously writing their own sequel. And when the true sequel finally arrives, fans are actually pissed when that sequel isn't their sequel. Fans are very tough to please. If you look at the best sequels, the ones everyone unanimously agrees are good, they are the ones that genuinely advance the story. They have a purpose for existing beyond just trying to sustain a brand. These are movies like Godfather Part 2, The Empire Strikes Back, Back to the Future Part 2, maybe. That's a topic for another debate. Aliens and Terminator 2. But the bottom line, those sequels all worked because they advanced the story. There is something left to be said. And most of those movies I just listed are for dramas and serious genre movies. Is it no wonder why most comedy sequels just aren't that good? If you don't like Ghostbusters 2, I guess I kind of get it. After all, that's a pretty popular opinion these days. But look at movies like Caddyshack 2, Porky's 2 The Next Day, Ted 2, Bad Santa 2, Coming to America, Dumb and Dumber 2, Look Who's Talking 2, Hot Tub Time Machine 2, and more American Graffiti. After watching all of those, you'd be begging to watch Ghostbusters 2. The truth of the matter is, once you go beyond that initial masterpiece, anything that comes out afterwards, whether it be a cartoon series, a serial, a toy line, or even another movie, it's suddenly a franchise. And franchises exist for no other reason than to make money. And let's face it, for better or worse, would anyone be talking about Star Wars or Harry Potter if they weren't still making movies based on these properties? Remember how popular the Lord of the Rings movies were at the turn of the century? When was the last time you heard anyone have a really in-depth conversation on those movies? When The Hobbit came out 9 years ago. So I guess my question is, would you rather there were a bunch of mediocre Ghostbusters films available to watch so you could all have something to discuss, continuing the franchise's valuable legacy? Or would you rather there were no new Ghostbusters movies and the franchise went dormant? Radio silence for years to come. People forget in the 90s, before the Star Wars special editions, Star Wars was pretty much thought of as a dead franchise, a relic of the 80s that once in a while got the occasional re-release on VHS, coupled with a few novels, comic books, and niche video games. Bottom line, I actually really like Ghostbusters 2. I hope my arguments have at least gotten you to see my side of things. I'm not trying to persuade you to change your opinion, but hopefully I've at least given a strong enough argument to support my unpopular opinion of a movie that, honestly, I feel still holds up.